Good morning. I'm going to finish out the ecology notes this morning. If you have not already filled out the first 5 pages from the videos from last week, I would encourage you to go back and do that first. But if you were at school last week, you're in the right place. So we had food chain at the bottom of the last page, so this must be food web. And the main difference is in a food web, we're able to show a little bit closer to reality here. They show many possible paths that energy can take through an ecosystem. On my Word document, everything seems a lot more clear. In this picture, everything's a little muddled, but these should all be arrows. Okay, so this would be a food chain. It shows one path of energy from the grass to the grasshopper to the mouse to the owl. But in a web, we see things are a little bit more complicated than that. I think that's going that way. Many different things feed on different other things and are prey for different other things. And even this is not as complicated as a real ecosystem, but it's getting closer. And I can't even tell what that is. I'm assuming it's eating the tree. And so things get, again, I don't know what that is. But you kind of get the idea. We got a lot more stuff going on. It's a little more accurate. Something that's missing out of this food web that sometimes you'll see is everything having an arrow back to the dirt labeled with decomposers. So it kind of completes the web. Remember, so the arrows are kind of showing the direction that energy travels, and energy doesn't, and the nutrients, I guess, are the only thing that kind of go back with the decomposers. The energy has kind of one path, and the decomposers can recycle energy. Alright, so nothing really too new and exciting there, but this might be a little bit more. So we have this idea of competition. And you inherently kind of know what competition is from sports and games and things. But in ecology, we think of it as the struggle to obtain limited resources. So when you think about what kind of resources are limited, those would be our limiting factors that we talked about on a previous page here. We have 2 kinds of competition. We have what's called interspecies competition, or species. Remember, inter means between, competition between species. So this would be when different species are competing for the same resource. So like there's a dead carcass out in the African savanna, you're going to see that lions and hyenas are very willing to fight for that resource, or try to scare each other off, or intimidate each other to fight for that resource. So anytime you have different species competing for one resource, we call that interspecies competition. And so then the opposite would be intra-species, intra meaning within. And again, these will sometimes be interspecific and intraspecific instead, but this is members of the same species compete for a resource. So if you see male animals fighting each other for the right to a female, or some squabbling over a space in a tree for a bird or something where it's the same species, that's intraspecies competition or intraspecific competition. Oops. Alright, so if you think back to our discussion of the niche, it's the job, right? It's the job that an organism is doing in its ecosystem. And just like in a workplace, maybe is a good example, 2 people really shouldn't have the exact same job, right? So even in a really big school, if there's more than one science teacher, they wouldn't be doing that job in the same place. Or maybe one would have one grade and one will have a different grade. Or in a school where, you have a janitor. They're not cleaning It's not like one's cleaning up the bathroom and the other one's following up behind him doing the exact same bathroom, right? We're going to divvy up the work. Nobody should have the exact same job in the exact same place at the exact same time. And that phenomena is called competitive exclusion. This is the idea that when there's competition for the same niche, my cat's just knocked something over, somebody is excluded. Okay, so one will be better at the job. Okay, whoever's better at that niche gets to keep it. Okay, if they're not the better one, they will either go extinct, leave, and go see if they can find a habitat where that other organism is not present or cannot beat them in that niche, or they can adapt to do something slightly different. So imagine another way to think about niches is positions on a volleyball team or any kind of team, really. So maybe you had your starters from last year and they all thought they were going to start again this year. Somebody moves in and she's better, right? So she's better at some position than somebody who thought she was going to have. So that new person's going to move in and be better at the niche of, let's say, middle hitter. Why not? And so the person who was middle hitter is either going to ride the bench, right, go extinct in terms of playing time, leave, go to another school where maybe she can play, or adapt to fill another niche. Maybe she's better at outside hitter than one of our existing players, so she maybe goes to outside hitter, and then the outside hitter has to figure out, okay, do I want to ride the bench? Do I want to leave and go to another team, or am I better at this job than somebody else? Okay, so it's only one can fill the exact niche at a time. Okay, so we've got a great example down here. We're going to look at this picture first. So these are two species of single-celled organisms, and we can grow them in petri dishes. Okay, so they're put on a petri dish. They have plenty of food. P. aurelia, grown separately, its population goes up and eventually levels out because that's the carrying capacity for that species. Same idea. P. caudatum, grown separately, its population goes up and then levels off at its carrying capacity. When we grow them, put them in the same petri dish, right? We put like one of each in the petri dish. Both their species start to go up, but then you see that one of them, the population continues to go up, and one of them, the population starts to go up, and it turns out they're not very as good at filling that niche. They lose the competition, and they end up pretty much going extinct. And I think if we saw this graph keep going, it would. And this is that one, and that's the P. aurelia. The original picture was in color, obviously, so you could tell which one was which. Okay, but here in the example below, they both do fine alone, but when grown together, then we have this idea of they both compete, for the same resource. So the idea is P. aurelia must be better at filling that niche because P. caudatum goes extinct. So competitive exclusion, only one species can fill the same niche. The loser goes extinct, leaves, or sometimes can adapt to do something else. All right, last page, ecological succession. Okay, so I like this description of it. A process of an ecosystem developing and changing as new plant life moves in. So this is the general path, and then we're going to talk about our two types of succession down below. So generally we can only have very small things like lichen and mosses. Remember, lichen is You know, that kind of green or orange or yellow stuff you sometimes see growing on tree bark or rocks in a damp environment. So they're going to start to break down rocks. Then grasses can grow. They develop and add nutrients to the developing soil. Once we start to have a little bit of soil, and then we can have also shrubs and small trees. Again, their roots developing the soil, breaking this underlying rock down even more, and adding more nutrients to the soil. And then if we're in an area that receives enough water, then we can have trees starting to grow in. We can talk about succession in two general ways. Succession that kind of starts from nothing. So it does not have soil, so it is starting with bare rock. And so this was what happened the very first time an ecosystem starts to grow. And so we have a word that just means first, and that's primary. So in primary succession, we're starting with nothing, only just rocks. We don't have any living things to grow from. We haven't developed any soil at all. And so this is actually not what happens most of the time. This might follow maybe a glacier melting, because if a glacier was there, it would have, as it grew, scraped any soil away and left bare rock. So when it melts, the rock is just left behind. Or after volcanic eruptions, because the volcano would eject lava, the lava would flow and solidify to form brand new rock. So then the alternative is we have something that disturbs the ecosystem but does not destroy the soil that was present. So this would be the second round of a succession, if you will. So we call it secondary succession. So think about things that would interrupt an ecosystem without destroying soil. So maybe a fire, flood, or really any kind of a severe storm that maybe knocks over trees or things like that. Because think about, the classic example is always a forest, but it's not always a forest. But if you think about if you were in a forest, all of a sudden all these trees get knocked down. Okay, before they shaded the ground, so grass couldn't really grow. So if you've ever been to a really dense forest, there's not really grass growing on the ground. It's pretty much bare or covered in tree needles or debris, stuff like that. But if a bunch of trees got knocked down, all of a sudden there's all this light hitting the ground, and so grasses are going to grow for a little while, and then trees are going to grow up in their place. At the end of succession, there is a stable community that will develop, and that is called the climax community. And just like in the timeline of a story, right, so you have like rising action and things get more exciting in the story, and then the climax is when everything, all the drama is happening. It's the highest point of the story, and it's the same idea with the community. A climax community has the most diversity of organisms that can exist in that particular climate. And then, of course, we have to bring in the big villain of the story, humans. Can affect our natural ecological processes at every single step. So when you think about things that make an ecosystem work, we have climate, which is changing in many places due to our increased emission of carbon dioxide and methane. So that is affecting ecosystems now and will continue to do so. We have habitats for many organisms that are disappearing, where we clear their natural habitat to build things or develop farm or ranch land. And nutrients are added, which you'd think would be a good thing, right? Oh, more nutrients, then more things can grow. Everybody wins. But if that was something that was limiting the ecosystem before, and we suddenly add a bunch of extra to it, things are just going to kind of get out of balance. So a lot of times we see this in agricultural areas or places where rivers feed into oceans, where all of a sudden the tiny microorganisms have too much nutrients, and so they grow like crazy and kind of get out of control, and that causes things like algal blooms, which can be toxic because as they go through their metabolism, they produce toxic things. All right, so that's the end of our ecology notes. I am still working on figuring out how tests are going to work, so you will hear updates from me. I'll put some review material up shortly.